I'm Rudy from Bingo Airsoftworks, and I'm going to take this opportunity to do a comparative review between the three major HPA engines that are available on the market today. We have the PolarStar Airsoft Fusion engine, the Wolverine Airsoft SMP, and the Valken V12. This video is going to go into details primarily about the engines themselves. I'm not going to go into overall shooting performance or how far a gun can shoot with one of these, because honestly an HPA engine is really just an air delivery mechanism. It has the advantages of consistency and maintainability and reliability, but it's just delivering air. So if you have an AEG gun that's shooting really well with an HPA system, it'll also should shoot very well. If you have one that shoots poorly, an HPA isn't necessarily going to make it shoot any better, because shooting performance is largely based on barrel, hop up, bucking, and BB. So if you've got the right combination and you have that tuned in well, your gun will shoot well with any three of these engines, and of course even as an AEG. So again, my focus will be about the engines themselves. I'm going to take an opportunity to go through and take each one apart so you'll be able to see some of the internals, and I'll just go over some of the strengths and weaknesses, in my opinion, of each of these engines. So for those of you that own or plan on purchasing one of these engines, your mileage may vary. You're going to probably have a different experience, but I just wanted to show you what I've learned working with these three. Full disclosure, I've actually installed quite a few PolarStar Fusion engines, several hundred engines since it was released over a couple years ago. On the SMP, I've only installed about half a dozen myself since it was released earlier this summer. And then for the V12, I've only done one install since I just was able to get my hands on one recently. So I will start with the Fusion engine and we'll go from there. Okay, first up I'm going to talk about the PolarStar Fusion engine. I'm going to go over some of the advantages and then go over some of the disadvantages from my opinion on the different engine platform. The PolarStar Fusion engine actually, or PolarStar Airsoft actually builds guns with the engine already installed. You can get different AR variants and AK variants, and they sell the engines by themselves for you to install in your own gun. This is the V2 version of their Fusion engine. They have a V3, an M249, an M240B, and they're about to release an M60 version as well. So the engine is a direct replacement for an existing gearbox. So it is actually very easy to swap out. You just extract the current gearbox, drop this gearbox in, and for the majority of the guns it'll just work. You know, straight pull one engine out, put another engine in, and you're good to go. The PolarStar engine actually has a fire control unit, which is used to control all the functions of the engine. This fire control unit attaches to this wire harness, and it's typically placed in the buffer tube or in the front handguard, and you can control it by, you use this little click and toggle switch on the circuit board here, and you can read the various settings by looking at the LCD screen. So an advantage is it's got a very nice fire control unit, which you can directly see all the different settings that you have, and there's actually quite a few different settings that you would be able to control on the way this gun behaves. All the timings for how the nozzle retracts and goes forward, and all kinds of really interesting things that you can do. So that's one of the advantages of the PolarStar platform, is the FCU. It actually also has a couple of interesting modes on it. Because it's a forward bias nozzle, meaning the nozzle when at rest is always fully forward, it has two different operating modes. They have a mode called closed bolt and open bolt. Open bolt essentially is a firing mode where it will, when you pull the trigger, it'll retract, load a BB, and then shoot the BB in that order. Pull the trigger, a BB is loaded, and then it's shot. Closed bolt does it in the opposite order. The first thing that it'll do is shoot the BB, retract, and then reload it. And so there's a BB sitting in your hop up until you pull the trigger again. So on semi-auto, you actually get instantaneous trigger response when you're on closed bolt mode, because there's always a BB ready to be fired. As soon as you pull the trigger, air shoots out the nozzle and the BB flies out of the gun. It then rechambers around. So absolutely instantaneous fire response, and that's an advantage because it's using a forward bias nozzle. Excuse me, a forward bias nozzle also allows you to do a couple other things. Because it's always inside the hop-up, the nozzle prevents any BBs from going into the hop-up while it's at rest. When it needs to fire a BB, it'll chamber the round and then shoot it. Or in the case of open closed bolt, there'll be one already there. But the hop-up is always blocked by the nozzle, so this could prevent some double feeds because there's always something preventing BBs from entering the hop-up. The forward nozzle also allows you to do air seal tests. Because it's all the way in the hop-up and into the bucking, you can check to see with the air seal by blowing down the inner barrel, and you can see if you've got a really good air seal or not. If it's a perfect seal, you won't get any leaks at all, and you can test that because the nozzle is always fully forward. The design of the PolarStar Fusion engine uses a poppet valve, so it has solenoids, 2 solenoids in this engine, which are used to control the poppet valve in this engine, excuse me. Now, because it has a poppet valve design, it allows a much higher FPS. The FPS range on the PolarStar Fusion engine could probably go as close to 700 FPS when you're running at 120 PSI with the appropriate barrel and bore. You can get really high up there, and the appropriate nozzle. So the Fusion engine has a high max FPS, but it also requires different nozzles to control the max FPS. The engine is designed to operate between 80 and 120 PSI, and between those PSI ranges there are different nozzle sizes, different colors with different diameters, inner diameters, which control the maximum FPS. So at the smallest inner diameter, which is very appropriate for CQB, at 120 PSI your maximum FPS may be only 350 because it's very, very small. If you put the largest diameter nozzle at 120 PSI, your max FPS will be closer to 500, 550. So with any given nozzle, you can control your FPS window between 80 and 120 PSI, and you'll get usually about between 50 to 80 FPS variance between those two pressure ranges as well. So I guess it'd be considered maybe a disadvantage by having to require different nozzles to give you different FPS windows to work within the PSI ranges that the engine is designed to. But it's actually, fortunately, very easy to change the nozzle on this engine. In fact, when the engine is inserted into a gun, you can change the nozzle without removing the engine. You just have to remove the 2 screws that hold the front cylinder in place. And I'm just going to do it here while it's outside. And you disassemble it by taking these 2 screws off the front, and the front cylinder will just unscrew. Again, you can imagine this is sitting inside of a gun. You unscrew the front cylinder, the nozzle pops out, and you can now re-lubricate the nozzle as required, and then reassemble the gun, and you're good to go. So it's very easy to maintain. Its design allows you to change the nozzle without actually removing the engine from the gun. Let's see. Also, based on the design of this engine, it allows different selector plates to be attached. It uses standard AEG selector plates. So if you have a gun that uses a V2 gearbox, you could put this engine in it if you are able to just swap the selector plate and sometimes swap the trigger out. The trigger is also completely removable, uses standard AEG triggers. So it allows you to go into certain types of guns as long as they're based on a V2 gearbox and you have a compatible selector plate. You can actually drop that in there. It also supports what's called a milsim airline routing. Most guns have the airline coming out of the pistol grip. This one's cut short because I use an amped grip line on here. But you can actually run the airline out the bottom of the engine or out the back of the engine if you want it to go toward the buffer tube. So because it's a custom gearbox shell, it allows you to do that. You can run the airline out the back. It's also capable for front and rear wiring. The wire harness can go out the back of the engine, or you can move it up and come out the front of the engine. And there are cutaways on the engine already which allow it to go forward or back. So it's very versatile that way as well. Okay, let's see, the other part I did want to show you here is just how the poppet valve works. And I'm going to go ahead and separate the upper cylinder, excuse me, from the lower cylinder, lower assembly. You just disconnect the solenoids. There's, again, I mentioned there's two solenoids on this engine, and they control the nozzle retracting and the poppet valve. When they're energized, the poppet valve opens up and allows air pressure from in this cylinder to shoot out the nozzle. And let's just take a quick look at the actual inner part here of the poppet cylinder. You can disassemble this pretty quickly, and you can see that here's the poppet valve. And in fact, I can take the poppet valve out by just removing the locking O-ring, this large O-ring which holds the poppet valve in place, and the valve comes out. And so what happens is this little section moves, and it allows air to go through the middle of this and out the nozzle. So that's a poppet valve. Okay, let's talk about some of the disadvantages of the PolarStar Fusion engine. Right off the bat, one of the strengths is also one of its weaknesses. Because the FCU has so many different settings on it, and there are so many aspects you can control, you can actually put yourself in a position where you've changed the settings and the engine won't work any longer. So it adds a little bit of complexity. If you don't mess with it, it should just work fine, but once you get access to this and you are able to start making all sorts of changes, you could easily tweak your engine to a point where it doesn't work properly. So often you have to reset it back to its default settings to get it to work correctly. So it could be a little bit complex for some users. Another disadvantage is the FCU continues to drain the battery as long as its battery's connected. If you left a small LiPo attached to it overnight, it will completely drain the LiPo and it'll be a dead battery. So as a matter of course, and it's always a good habit, just disconnect your batteries from the FCU and you won't have that issue. You really shouldn't keep your batteries connected anyway, but that is a disadvantage. It will drain your battery. It also doesn't work well with 11.1 volt batteries. I have another video that shows if you hook up an 11.1 to this, it'll overheat the voltage regulator and the full auto won't work properly. So avoid using 11.1s with the PolarStar FCU. Because of its design with the poppet valve and that it has two other solenoids it has to activate, it potentially could be less air efficient than some of the other engines on the market. This can be addressed by setting up your Fusion engine to run at the lowest operating PSI. Essentially, you want it to operate at around 70 to 80 PSI, and you should have quite a bit of efficiency on your shots. So with a 90-4500 tank, you could get close to 6,000 shots out of that, which isn't too bad. But at the higher PSIs, when you go up to 120, you're going to get significantly fewer shots out of that same tank of air. A weak point of this design is also the wire harness. This wire harness, which is used to connect the FCU to the engine, either to the back of the gun or to the front, is a weak point because it's easy to damage this. Some steps have been taken to make it a little bit more durable by putting this webbing around it, but the wires and the connector, if this is bent too much or bent too sharply, you can break the wires or break the connector, and then you have to replace this. So a weakness is having this wire harness exposed and having to deal with that. One of the earlier on problems, it's probably not as prevalent now, but it used to be an issue for some folks, is that these solenoids can leak. If you get dirt or debris inside the solenoid by having it go up through the airline, it can foul up the O-rings that are in here, and you essentially have to replace the solenoids. So it's not as much of a problem now that I've noticed, because I think PolarStar has actually changed their solenoids, and the QC from the factory has gotten better, or whatever they've done. So there's not as many leaky solenoids on them out there, but that has been an issue in the past. So you want to just be aware that it's not cheap to replace one of these. So these can fail on you. Compatibility with different guns. I think I might have mentioned it earlier, but it's a V2 gearbox design, but each manufacturer of V2 gearbox guns has their own little tweak that they add. and so sometimes this fusion engine will not sit properly in the gun, and you may have to do some tweaks to make it align properly. You'll install it and the nozzle won't be lined up with the hop-up, so all kinds of odd things will start happening. Or the fire select isn't going to interface with the selector plate properly, or the safety doesn't engage. Again, it's not the majority of guns. I'm saying actually the majority of guns will probably work just fine. There's a small percentage of them where they're a little off spec, and you have to deal with that because you're replacing the gearbox with something that's not native to that gun. You have to deal with it and make adjustments to the fusion engine and shim it or adjust it so it fits properly in there. Let's see, and I guess one of the other disadvantages, it's the most expensive engine on the market. So of the three that I'm going to be discussing today, this comes in with the highest price tag. But there you have it, the different advantages and disadvantages of the PolarStar fusion engine, from my opinion. Kind of focusing mostly on how this is used in its normal course of use as an engine that goes into a V2 or its target platform. I specifically do a lot of customization, so I take this and use it in a lot of custom installs. And because of, again, of its design that these two are separate parts and it has very convenient mount points on this, I can put this in a lot of different platforms that aren't V2 or any other kind of gearbox style. Also, there's a lot of extra material here which can be milled away and cut to allow this to fit in other areas that normally a full V2 engine won't fit. So it's pretty flexible on extreme custom installs, but that's kind of what I'm in the business of doing. Next up, I'll talk about the Wolverine SMP.